So with that, let's move on to the driving experience. This is definitely the most fun car I've had to drive. The driving experience is super engaging, it's super raw, and it's the only car I've ever experienced that is so involved to drive that it lets you forget about anything else in your day because you're so focused on and involved with the driving experience. And as I've said in other videos, I've got a motorcycle riding background. I get that experience and that sensation a lot when riding motorcycles. This is the first time I have ever gotten that experience from a car. And when I test drove the Lotus Elise, that had a lot of the rawness, but this was like the rawness with the level of acceleration you get on a motorcycle, which I think the Lotus Elise just really lacked. And I think that makes this a little bit more involved and a little bit more terrifying actually than what the Lotus could provide. So with that, you know the Viper is a fast car. You can look at the acceleration numbers, you can look at the horsepower numbers, but I don't think what the numbers present on paper do justice to what the car feels like when you're driving it. And the best way that I can explain this is that I have owned cars at different power levels. So I had a 200 horsepower car, I had a 300 horsepower car. The Mustang was a little over 400 horsepower, and then this is technically just over 500 horsepower. But on top of that, I've just driven a lot of different cars at different power levels as well. I've driven them back to back, I've driven them for long periods of time. So I've got a good feel for what different power levels should feel like for a similar weight vehicle, and the Viper just feels like it punches way above its weight class. So on paper, the Viper is about 100 horsepower more than what my Mustang GT had. It's about 130 foot-pounds of torque more than what the Mustang GT had. But in practice, it feels like 150 to a 200 horsepower jump, and the reason is because of how that power is distributed. Here is a dyno graph of a stock Viper, and if you've never seen a dyno graph before, it shows you your horsepower and your torque level, usually at the wheels, against the RPM of the engine. So when you're winding up an engine and you're going through the rev range, how does the power level change as you wind out the engine? So what a lot of people focus on is just that peak power number. So when I say like the Mustang's got 420 horsepower, that's its peak power level, and that could just be at 1 RPM. But the Viper has that peak power level, it has pretty much that same amount of power across the entire rev band. And the torque it has across the entire rev band, which means it doesn't matter what gear you're in, it doesn't matter what RPM you're in, you are going to accelerate just as hard regardless of what speed you're going and what gear you're in. That car is ridiculous. It pulls super hard in every gear at any speed. The only other car I have had that had such a flat power band and had so much power everywhere was my WRX after I modified it. So on paper, it was like 250 all-wheel horsepower, but I had roughly the same power within give or take 15 horsepower from 3,000 RPM to redline. So it didn't matter where I was in the band, I still had pretty much that full power, and I saw 2 sets of taillights ever in that car. I'm not saying that was the fastest car of all time, but a lot of the people who would try to race me, even if they had like the 400 horsepower mark, the distribution of the power, they had 400 horsepower for like, 12 RPM, and the rest of the time they were way down. So for me to come in and just have the same consistent max power for pretty much start to finish, the car performed a lot better than what the numbers implied. And the Viper does the same thing with power distribution, but it does it with twice as much horsepower as my WRX had. It is ridiculous. Don't get me wrong, it's super fun, I love it, but I'm amazed I'm still alive and that I have a license, I'll put it that way. The next thing is that this car being built on excess, everything about it is deliberate. So the steering is very heavy, but also the steering ratio is very sharp. So a very small turn of the steering wheel, there's almost no dead zone, and the ratio of steering input to tire turning is very aggressive. It is one of the quickest steering ratios that I have ever experienced. The seats are also super tight, and like I said, you're super low down. It really hugs you, so it really gives you that full body feedback of what's going on with the car. And also the shifter is super deliberate, which is actually something I heard before buying the car, but I didn't really understand the extent to what that really implied. Now, I've had it described that the shifter takes some level of force, but what I didn't realize is that it is physically difficult to shift this car from gear to gear. So when I say you have to be deliberate when shifting this thing, I mean, you've got to especially if you want to shift fast, you got to push or pull pretty hard. And if you want to go through gears, you better mean it. And I don't know if that's the transmission, I don't know if that's the linkages or the bushings, or I don't know what it is, but the way they set that car up, it takes force to go from one gear to another, which goes in with the theme, right? Like, they want everything in this car to be deliberate, they want it to be planned, they want it to be intentional, but you can't just go for the casual road through gears. You gotta go hammering every time, every shift, drive this car like you mean it. And if you're not in that mood, don't drive the car. That's what it comes down to. But what that also means is that this is going to impact your shift times. So all the videos that I ever saw growing up in loving Vipers, every single time I was like, wow, this guy needs a driver mod. I always just assumed that the people driving the Vipers were just terrible drivers and that they didn't know how to shift. I've got a lot of manual experience. I've got a lot of performance driving experience. I consider myself to have a pretty quick shift time. Even so, my shifts are noticeably slower on this car, and like I said, it's just physically difficult. So now, having experienced it firsthand, I can see why, especially if you have less experience than I do, it would take you a lot longer to shift this car. Don't expect to buy this car and have it make you look like the god of driving. Expect to buy it and to have it point out every single flaw and insecurity you have about your driving skills. Because that's what it's going to do. It's going to highlight your mistakes, it's going to point out your shortcomings, and if you do something stupid, it will bite you for it. The next thing, which also really parallels it to motorcycles, specifically the leader bikes, is that the gearing in it is super tall. So the exact gear ratios differ depending on which generation or which year you get, but in mine, first gear goes to about 60 miles an hour, second gear goes to low 80 miles per hour, third gear goes to something like 115, and it's a 6-speed transmission, and it doesn't have enough power to max this out. But supposedly, if you had enough power, 6th gear is geared for something like 303 miles per hour. It's something ridiculous. And the Gen 3 tops out at like 194 miles per hour, something like that. But the point is, the gearing on this is so tall, the only other car I've driven that has such tall gearing is the C6 Z06 Corvette. Everything else, you're at the top end of 2nd gear to get to 60 miles per hour, or you're halfway through 3rd gear to get to 60 miles an hour. Viper, 1st gear. 1st gear all day. And if you want to use 6th gear, you can't even consider 6th gear until you're doing at least 80 to 85 on the highway. And even then, you're spinning at like 1500 RPM. It's like stupidly low RPM. Taking a sidestep from that, the practicality on this car is atrocious.